Let's have a look at Big Ben. Not seen it for a while. There it is. Coming up to midday with us, our political editor, Laura Kunsberg. So he asked the people what questions he should ask today. He got over 40,000. Do we know how he's going to handle all that?
No, in a word. He says he wants to do something different. He says he wants to be polite. He wants to have substantive debate. Now, I think it's probably quite a long time since many of our viewers can remember there being real substantive, polite debate in Prime Minister's questions. And, you know, that takes us right to the paradox here. One Labour MP said to me, the hope is the less Jeremy Corbyn looks like a Prime Minister, the more people may want him to be Prime Minister. But survival in the day-to-day brutal rough and tumble of Westminster is quite another thing. And that's what's so interesting about it. We have a leader here whose power base is not on those benches. His power base is around the country with campaigners and activists. But that's not going to make the next few days straightforward. If you look at the last 48 hours, refreshing, perhaps chaotic, certainly.
Do you know how the Labour MPs are going to treat him when he stands up? Because he got a very muted response at the Parliamentary Labour Party meeting on Monday, didn't he?
He did. Lukewarm was the word. Not overtly hostile, but very lukewarm. I think there will be a sort of politeness. It will be very interesting to see. And actually looking at the benches, they look quite full. Some people thought quite a lot of MPs might just quietly have something a bit more important
how could
to do.
They miss
Not
it?
Great numbers. But one way of sort of dealing with this, not being involved in the Corbyn project, but not being overtly critical, giving him space, is just by sort of politely, you know, having an important dentist appointment or something like that. But it looks like the benches are pretty full.
But they're watching on the Daily Politics.
Of course. And the overall sense has to be, they don't like it. They didn't want this to happen. But with the mandate he has, 250,000 people putting him as the leader, and that swarm of new members also growing by the days before and since his election, they have to give him a chance. And even those who want him out and would like him out immediately, they're not going to do it now. They know they can't.
They haven't got a mandate to do that.
They haven't got a mandate. And even if they did, it would be the same electorate. Yes. And they don't have a candidate around.
And they'd be furious.
And they would be absolutely furious.
There is a personal difficulty for Mr. Corbyn, though. But as a backbencher, he spent nearly all of the last 30 years talking to the converted, preaching to the converted, not dealing with hostile audiences, dealing with people who broadly agreed with his left-wing agenda. The Prime Minister's questions is very different.
That's absolutely right. And even beyond the House, why this is important is because Prime Minister's questions, not just for the viewers of the Daily Politics, but for the voting public who's abreast of the news but not obsessed with every twist and turns, this is the shop window. This is the chance politically to get your issues to the top of the agenda, to get the government on the back foot. But this is the shop window. So as well as the rather unfortunate row about whether or not he sang the national anthem, today, for millions of ordinary voters, not those who've been at his rallies around the country, this is the little glimpse of him they're going to see. And impressions now are formed so fast. You can talk, as no doubt you have, about the importance of discussion and frank debates. But people are going to see snippets of this today, and that's why his tone and how it comes across is really important.
Is he still sticking to the idea that he may pass PMQs around?
There's a bit of sort of confusion about what that really means. I mean, Lisa may well know better than I, but I understand that he's still open to the idea of, on occasion, allowing other people to do it for him. What was bubbling around on day one, this idea that other people might pop up and actually ask questions when he's there, that seems to have disappeared for now.
Fancy a go at PMQs?
Yeah, I'm doing it next week, actually.
Excellent.
Daily Politics.
There we go, a scoop.
There we go. Well, we'll be covering that live as well.
The queues will be even bigger.
And then Mr. Cameron has to be careful how to handle this, doesn't he? The flashman has got to stay under control.
Yes, and the strategy is be calm, be firm, be explanatory. Now, in a sense, if Mr. Corbyn's being consensual and polite, it's an opportunity for Mr. Cameron to come up and give his explanations without that much challenge. However, whether he'll resist the temptation, very great in PMQs.
And he loses his temper sometimes.
Indeed. Whether he can resist the temptation to use the odd jibe or two, I think that's going to be quite difficult, but maybe not on day one. Certainly the strategy for number 10 is to play it calm, to look grown up, to look like the master in charge of everything, and therefore to deal with Mr. Corbyn's questions, whatever they are.
Let's go straight over to Prime Minister's questions in the House of Commons.
Prime Minister, Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Mr. Gordon Henderson.
Mr. Speaker, 75 years ago, Spitfires and Hurricanes were flying over Sittingbourne and Sheppey in the Battle of Britain, defending our country from Hitler's aggression. Yeah. It's particularly appropriate the Royal Air Force protected the Isle of Sheppey because it was the birthplace of British aviation, something with which we islanders are immensely proud. Yeah. Will the Prime Minister join with me in paying tribute to those courageous RAF airmen who helped ensure the freedoms we enjoy today?
Yes. I certainly join my honourable friend in doing that. There was a very moving service in St Paul's yesterday where many of us were able to pay tribute to those brave pilots, to the ground crews, to all of those involved in what was not just an important moment in British history, but a vital moment in world history as Britain stood alone, the only thing that could stop Hitler and Nazism. And it's a reminder of how proud we should be of our armed forces then, today, and always.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank all those that took part in an enormous democratic exercise in this country, which concluded with me being elected as leader of the Labour Party and leader of the opposition. I think we can be very proud of the numbers of people who engaged and took part in all those debates. I've taken part in many events around the country and had conversations with many people about what they thought about this place, our Parliament, our democracy, and our conduct within this place. And many told me that they thought Prime Minister's Question Time was too theatrical, that Parliament was out of touch and too theatrical, and they wanted things done differently, but above all, they wanted their voice heard in Parliament. So I thought my first Prime Minister's Question Time, I'd do it in a slightly different way. And I'm sure the Prime Minister is going to absolutely welcome this, as he welcomed this idea in 2005. But something seems to have happened to his memory during that period. And so I sent out an email to thousands of people and asked them what questions they would like to put to the Prime Minister. And I received 40,000 replies. Now, there isn't time to ask 40,000 questions today, and our rules limit us to 6. And so I would like to start with the first one, which is about housing. 2,500 people emailed me about the housing crisis in this country. And I asked one from a woman called Marie, who says, what does the government intend to do about the chronic lack of affordable housing and the extortionate rents charged by some private sector landlords in this country? Prime Minister.
Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate the honourable gentleman on his resounding victory in the Labour leadership election? Can I welcome him to the front bench and to these exchanges? I know we will have many strong disagreements, I'm sure, between us at these exchanges, but where we can work together in the national interest, we should do so, and I wish him well in his job. If we are able to change Prime Minister's questions and to make it a more genuine exercise in asking questions and answering questions, no one would be more delighted than me. I felt last week where we discussed a substantial issue with substantial questions and proper answers was good for our House, good for our democracy, and so I welcome it. Now let me answer very directly Marie's question, because we do need to see more affordable housing in our country. We delivered 260,000 affordable housing units in the last Parliament. We built more council houses in our country than in the 13 previous years had been managed, but I recognise much more needs to be done. That means carrying on with our reform of the planning system. It means encouraging the building industry to come up with innovative schemes like starter homes. But above all, it means continuing to support the aspirations of people to be able to afford their own home, which is where Help to Buy and schemes like that come in. But I'd say to the honourable gentleman, we won't get Britain building unless we keep our economy going.
Jeremy Corbyn.
I thank the Prime Minister for that answer, and I thank him for his commitment that we're going to try and do Prime Minister's Question Time in a more adult way than we've done in the past. The effects of government policy on housing are obviously enormous. And the decision made to cut, for example, 1% of the rent levels in councils and in housing associations without thinking about the funding issues that those authorities face is a serious one. I've got a question from Stephen, who works for a housing association, who says that the cut in rents will mean that the company he works for will lose 150 jobs by next March because of the loss of funding of that housing association to carry on with the repairs. Down the line, it will mean worse conditions, worse maintenance and fewer people working in it, and a greater problem for those living in those properties. Does the Prime Minister not think it's time to reconsider the question of the funding of the administration of housing, as well as, of course, the massive gap of 100,000 units a year between what is needed and what is being built?
Minister.
What I would say to Stephen and all those working in housing associations and doing a good job is that I think for years in our country we had something of a merry-go-round where rents went up, housing benefit went up, and so taxes had to go up to pay for that. And I think it was right in the budget to cut the rents that social tenants pay, not least because those people who are working and not on housing benefit will see a further increase in their take-home pay and be able to afford more things in life. Now, I think it's vital, though, that we reform housing associations and make sure they are more efficient. Frankly, they're a part of the public sector that hasn't been through efficiencies, haven't improved their performance, and I think it's about time that they did.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, I thank the Prime Minister for that, but it leads me neatly on to what happened yesterday in the House when the House sadly voted through proposals which are going to cost £1,300 per year to families affected by the change in tax credits. This is absolutely shameful. I had more than 1,000 questions on tax credits. Paul, for example, says this very heartfelt question: why is the government taking tax credits away from families? We need this money to survive so our children don't suffer. Paying rent and council tax on a low income doesn't leave you much. Tax credits play a vital role, and more is needed to stop us having to become reliant on food banks to survive.
What we need is a country where work genuinely pays, and that's why what our proposals do are reform welfare, but at the same time bring in a national living wage, which will mean anyone on the lowest rate of pay will get a £20 a week pay rise next year. And that's why the figures show that a family... So I thought this was the new question time. I'm not sure the message has fully got home. I don't want to blind the House with statistics, but I just give you these two. One, a family with someone on minimum wage, after all our changes, will be £2,400 better off. Second statistic, and I think this is really important. If you look at what happened between 1998 and 2009, in-work poverty went up by 20% at the same time as in-work benefits went from 6 billion to 28 billion. The old way of doing things isn't working, and we shouldn't go back to it. What we've got to do is tackle the causes of poverty, get people back to work, improve our schools, improve childcare. Those are the ways we can create an economy where work pays and everyone's better off.
The Institute of Fiscal Studies says there are 8 million people in paid work eligible for benefits or tax credits. They are, on average, being compensated by just 26% of their losses by the so-called national living wage that the government has introduced. And so I ask a question from Claire, who says this: how is changing the thresholds of entitlement for tax credits going to help hard-working people or families? I work part-time. My husband works full-time, earning $25,000. They have 5 children. This decrease in tax credits will see our income plummet. They ask a simple question: how is this fair?
The country has to live within its means, and we were left an unaffordable welfare system and a system where work didn't pay. Now, we see today the latest set of employment statistics where the rate of employment in our country has reached yet again a record high. More people in work, more people in full-time work, and also are seeing unemployment fall in every region of the country except the southeast, and the sharpest falls are in the northwest, the northeast and the West Midlands. What we're doing is moving from an economy with low wages, high tax and high welfare to an economy where we have higher wages, lower taxes and less welfare. That is the right answer. An economy where work pays, an economy where people can get on. And let us not go back to the days of unlimited welfare. Labour's position again today is to abolish the welfare cap. I say that a family that chooses not to work shouldn't be better off than one that chooses to work.
Many people don't have that choice. Many people live in a very difficult situation and rely on the welfare state in order to survive. Surely all of us have a responsibility to make sure people can live properly and decently in modern Britain. That is surely a decent civil thing to do. I received over 1,000 questions on the situation facing our mental health services and people that suffer from mental health conditions. This is a very, very serious situation across the whole country, and I want to put to the Prime Minister a question that was put to me quite simply from Gail. Do you think it's acceptable that the mental health services in this country are on their knees at the present time?
Prime Minister.
Well, as I mentioned before the first question, there will be areas where we can work together, and I believe this is one of them. We do need to do more to increase mental health services in our country. We've made some important steps forward in recent years. Mental health and physical health now have parity in the NHS constitution. We've introduced for the first time waiting time targets for mental health services, so they're not seen as a Cinderella service. And of course, we've made the commitment, a commitment that I hope he will back, undoing previous Labour policy. We've backed the Stevens plan for an extra £8 billion into the NHS in this Parliament, which can help to fund better mental health services, among other things. There are problems in some mental health services, and it's right we make that commitment. But I make this one point to him. We will not have a strong NHS unless we have a strong economy. And if the Labour Party is going to go down the route of unlimited spending, unlimited borrowing, unlimited tax rates, printing money, they will wreck the economic security of our country and the family security of every family in our country. We won't be able to afford a strong NHS without a strong economy.
If I could take the Prime Minister back to the situation of mental health in this country, it is very serious. I agree with him absolutely on parity of service. I hope that the spending commitments are brought forward rather than delayed to the end of this Parliament, because the crisis is a very serious one. We know this from our constituents. We know this from people we meet. We know this from the devastation that many face, and indeed some have taken their own lives because of the devastation they face. I asked a question from Angela, who's a mental health professional, so she knows exactly what she's talking about. And she quotes this: "Beds are unobtainable, with the result that people suffering serious mental health crises are either left without adequate care or alternatively admitted to facilities many miles away from their homes, relatives and family support systems. The situation is simply unacceptable." What does the Prime Minister say to Angela, to people like her who work so hard in the mental health services, or people going through a mental health crisis who may well be watching us today on Prime Minister's Question Time and want to know that we take seriously their conditions, we take seriously their need for emergency beds to be near their homes and their support system, and that we as a society take seriously their plight and are going to help them and care for them. What does the Prime Minister say to Angela?
What I would say to Angela, all those working in mental health, or indeed those suffering from mental health conditions, is that we need to do more as a country to help tackle mental health. Now, that's obviously money into the health service, which we will deliver, but it's also changing the way that the health service helps those with mental health conditions. The Honourable Gentleman rightly talks about mental health beds, and they are important, but frankly, so is the service that people get when they visit their GP. Many many people going to our GP surgeries have mental health conditions, but actually aren't treated for those conditions and don't get access to, for instance, the cognitive behavioural therapies that are increasingly being made available. So my argument is, yes, put in the resources, change the way the NHS works, change public attitudes to mental health, because that is vital. But I say it again, we won't be able to do any of these things without the strong economy that we've built these last 5 years.
Mr. Andrew Turner.
The Isle of Wight Zoo is having difficulty importing a tiger. She was firstly cruelly treated in a circus and now has been kept in isolation for nearly 2 years, despite Belgium being wholly free from rabies. Will my right honourable friend assist in breaking through this bureaucratic logjam?
I will certainly do anything I can to help my honourable friend.
Tiger. I think the House wants to hear about the tiger. Let's hear about it.
I do want to hear about the tiger. And the point is this, we will help with the DEFRA Animal and Plant Health Agency, because they are the ones working on this. I had a constituency case exactly like this with the Cotswold Wildlife Park wanting to bring in a rhino, and I intervened, and I'm delighted to say the Cotswold Wildlife Park named the rhino Nancy in honour of my daughter. And Nancy has been breeding ever since she arrived in Burford, and I hope that this tiger is also as effective.
Mr. Angus Robertson.
May I begin by congratulating the new leader of the Labour Party. We in the SNP look forward to working with him in opposing Tory austerity. We hope the Labour MPs will join him and us in opposing Trident when that happens. 1 year ago today, Mr. Speaker, 1 year ago today, to the day, the Prime Minister made a vow to the people of Scotland. Promises were made to deliver home rule and as near to federalism as possible. However, former Prime Minister Gordon Brown now says that the UK government is, and I quote, falling short on the delivery of the recommendations of the Smith Commission on Scottish devolution. When will the Prime Minister deliver on the promises that he made to the people of Scotland?
We have delivered on all of the promises that we made. We said we would introduce a Scotland Bill. We introduced a Scotland Bill. We said unprecedented devolution on taxes. There's been unprecedented devolution on taxes. We said that we'd provide those welfare powers. We've given those welfare powers. The question is now for the SNP. When are you going to stop talking about processes, and when are you going to start telling us what taxes you're going to put up, what welfare changes you're going to be made? Or are you, when it comes to talking about the issues, frit?
Angus Robertson.
Very interesting. Whatever happened to the new style of PMQs from the Prime Minister? So, Mr. Speaker, one of the architects of the vow says it's not being fully delivered, as does the Scottish Trade Union Congress, the Scottish Council on Voluntary Organisations, Carers Scotland, Enable Scotland. They say that not enough welfare powers are being devolved. Only 9% of people in Scotland believe the vow has been delivered. Not one single amendment has been accepted by the government in the Scotland Bill. Mr. Speaker, Tory bluster and condescension will not go down well in Scotland. So for a second time, may I ask the Prime Minister, in his new style of answering in Prime Minister's questions, when will he deliver on the promises that were made to the people of Scotland?
Obviously, it's going to get a bit of getting used to, but let me try and answer him very calmly. What I noticed from his question is that he hasn't given me one single example of where the vow wasn't delivered. If he can point to a tax we promised to devolve but haven't devolved, I would accept it. If he can point to a welfare change we promised to devolve but didn't devolve, I would accept it. He hasn't done those things. All he is doing is continuing an argument about process because he doesn't want to talk about the substance. You give me a list, he should give me a list of the things that were promised and weren't delivered, then we can have a very reasonable conversation. Until then, it is all bluster from the SNP.
And that brings us to the end of the first Prime Minister's questions with Jeremy Corbyn as Leader of Her Majesty's Opposition. And he said he'd do things differently, and he did do things differently. There was a different tone to today's PMQs, and he sort of crowdsourced his questions and mentioned who was asking the question and the number of people who had asked questions on this particular subject. So he covered housing. He then went on to tax credits and the withdrawal of tax credits from some working families, and then moved on to mental health. Indeed, there were 2 questions on mental health, and the Prime Minister therefore answered his questions as best he could. There were, of course, no follow-up, so it was kind of hard to pin the Prime Minister down on a couple of these issues, but we'll discuss how he did in a minute. But we'll welcome Joko back, hot from the House of Commons.
Yes, I ran all the way over.
You've got some responses to today's PMQs, but before you get on to them, what was it like?
Extraordinary, actually. I mean, I literally got the last seat in the House. I managed to squeeze into the corner as it was starting, and I have never seen the chamber so packed to the rafters, on the public gallery side, on the press gallery side, and most definitely within the chamber itself. Ministers were actually up in the side bits of the gallery too, because they obviously couldn't get in downstairs. So in that regard, it was extraordinary. It was also completely different to any other PMQs I've watched, in the sense that there was so much anticipation within the House. I could only see the Tory MPs from where my seat was, and they looked a little nervous, a little bit, I don't know what's coming here. We don't know what to expect. Even George Osborne and David Cameron looked a little bit apprehensive, because none of us knew what was going to happen. There was a louder Labour cheer than I thought there might be, bearing in mind...
when Mr Corbyn stood up?
When Mr Corbyn stood up, I thought... I mean, he wasn't greeted in the silence that was reported from the Parliamentary Labour Party earlier in the week. So there was more of a cheer. And then, of course, he did change the tone, as you say, and he changed the whole exchange, really. And by using his sort of people's question time, what it did was it deprived David Cameron of an opportunity to ridicule, as I'm sure they would like to do over, what's happened over the last 4 days, because he would have been ridiculing Stephen, Gail, Angela, all those people that asked the questions.
He can't, but it also gave him a chance to set out his stall.
And that was the other side. So the downside for Jeremy Corbyn was that he was able to very clearly set out the lines that he wants to get across to the public too, about a stronger economy is needed for a stronger NHS, for those mental health services. So in a way, although Jeremy Corbyn was spared a lot of criticism, he did allow David Cameron, as you quite rightly say, to set out his stall. But I think it was difficult.
It was certainly difficult and different.
And different for everybody.
And we'll see how long.
But I don't think you could sustain that every week.
Well, we shall see, because we'll be here every week. That's as good as it gets.
Lucky you.
Unlike some people here. What did the viewers make of it?
Right, well, Richard Barnes in Thames Ditton. It's a miracle. PMQs without the schoolboy jeering. Corbyn was brilliant. Similar sentiment from Michael Whiteley in Bournemouth. Finally, Prime Minister's question time focuses on problems facing ordinary people. Good to see the smugness gone. Good to see the petty politicking out, and decent questions from a decent Labour leader. But I have to say, on the other side, Alan McInnes says patronising. These Houses of Parliament have done these things over hundreds of years, and this guy walks in and thinks he can just change everything because he thinks so. It's his job to question the Prime Minister, not emails from God knows who. He really is out of touch and a reality dreamer. Jim Patterson from the Borders, bring back old PMQs. This new way is dying on its feet. Michael Short from Hampshire. Jeremy Corbyn trying to be clever by pitching questions from the public. He has been voted as leader to represent the party and push his policies. So, as you see, just very briefly though, genuine Labour supporters must be devastated to see Citizen Corbyn standing where great statesmen have held the high office of opposition leader. Here's a question from Helen Jeremy. Will you sing God Save the Queen in future?
I think we've done that.
I think you have.
To death. Laura, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think we just saw a sort of Prime Minister's questions revolution in beige. I mean, this was a serious attempt from Jeremy Corbyn's team, a very serious attempt to do things differently, to set out a new framework. And today, at least, the Prime Minister had to accept that framework. And they will be, I think, relieved by that. It didn't descend into farce. I think David Cameron's side might also be a bit relieved about it, because for them, asking David Cameron open questions is really an opportunity for him to bat them back pretty straightforwardly. and just to set out his position, as we heard there, on why they've made the decisions they have made on the economy, why they've made the decisions they have on how to reform the public services. So Jeremy Corbyn has had a success in the regard that it wasn't a calamity, it wasn't chaotic. David Cameron had to respond to him on Corbyn's terms, but there was no follow through, there was no comeback, and Prime Minister's questions, although some people hate it, some emailers delighted with a new style, it is that golden opportunity for the opposition leader to make some ground, to put their ideas forward and to get the government on the back foot. And I think this approach, as Joe suggested, you can't do it every week, and if he does it like that every week, that is not going to allow him to make that transformation into people that somebody who looks like a potential Prime Minister for millions of voters.
Can you do it every week, Lisa Nandy?
Well, I think it was, I found it just really fascinating to watch. I didn't really know what to expect either. And I think there are two things that have come out of this, notwithstanding the questions about, nailing Cameron and not letting him off the hook. The first is that we've had all these headlines about Jeremy Corbyn since he was elected a few days ago. But what the public, I think, will have seen is just a thoroughly decent guy standing at the dispatch box talking about the issues that matter to them. We've had years and years of talking about a people's question time and how we should bring that into the House of Commons, and he's had 3 days and he's done it, so that's quite exciting. And that's the second thing that I think is really important, is that people have said that it's been chaos, and we've had that today in the studio, people saying it's been a disaster, but actually that is quite highly effective. He has changed Prime Minister's questions.
But I understand that, and it certainly wasn't.
So
it was no car crash.
That's the question.
So my question was, can he sustain it? Can he crowdsource these questions every week, not do follow-ups?
I think the biggest question actually from watching that exchange is if Cameron can sustain it. So 7 questions in, and Cameron reverted back to type. He accused the opposition members of being frit.
It was Angus Robertson, the SNP.
Yeah, and hurling insults across the chamber, as we've seen over the last 5 years. And you could see him sort of straining to try and do the new way of doing politics. And as he said himself, it doesn't come naturally to him. So I think that's the question, because I suspect that Jeremy will continue in that vein of asking reasonable questions that the public want answers to, and whether Cameron starts to answer them or not, I think will be, one of his biggest challenges.
Well, Laura mentioned that there was a lack of a follow-up and trying to pin him down. But of course, we have follow-ups here on the Daily Politics. The Jeremy Corbyn began by talking about the housing crisis. And it's generally regarded that we need, simply to cope with population growth and net rise in immigration, contrary to your party's promises at the election, between 200 and 250,000 new houses a year. So in the financial year 2013-14, how many did your government build?
So I'm not allowed to comment on PMQs.
Well, I'll come back to that.
I was really looking forward to commenting.
What's the answer to my
question? Which I really enjoyed. We're hoping to build 140,000 homes.
No, how many did you build in 2013-14?
About 120,000.
No, you actually built 134.
Oh, good.
But it's still... but
I thought I would underplay it.
But hold on.
But now people are cheering.
Hold on, it's 100,000 short of what we require.
Yeah.
How many have you built in the financial year that ended this April?
127,000.
So, you built 137,000, which is 3,000 more than the previous year.
Yeah.
So, in other words, it's static.
Yeah.
There is no housing boom in this country. For the second year running, you were 100,000 behind what we need. This housing crisis can only get worse.
Well, I think as somebody who represents a rural constituency where a lot of my constituents are complaining about the amount of planning applications going in, the amount of houses being built around them, I can see that it's a difficult circle to square. But the government has made it absolutely clear that we want to build more houses. We've said again and again and again that we are not building enough houses.
So why aren't you doing it?
Well, we're trying to change planning laws to make it easier to build houses. The Help to Buy scheme, because a lot of houses are being built and they're not being sold, has also kick-started, certainly in my constituency, it's kick-started a lot of house sales. Brandon Lewis, the housing minister, works overtime to try and move aside regulations that are stopping.
So why isn't it working? 5 years into your government. Hold on, 5 years into your government, and you can still build in England. I'm only using England because that's all you're responsible for. 137,700 homes. It's still 50 to 60,000 below what the last Labour government built in 2006. And yet, There's a housing crisis.
Well, we know that under the last Labour government, house building fell quite dramatically.
Only after the financial crash.
That was partly because of the financial crash.
Entirely because of the financial crash.
And now we've come out of that recession and we're building the economy back up again. That's why house building is now increasing. But you can't deny the government hasn't moved.
You are only building 20,000 homes more than you did in the depths of the recession in 2010. In 5 years, you've only managed to add 20,000 more homes in a country that needs between 200 and 250,000 homes every year to be built.
Yeah.
You are failing to meet the housing crisis.
Well, what we've done and what has happened, particularly in my constituencies, we've set stretching housing targets. We've put councils in charge of putting together local plans to increase house building. In my own constituency, there's a commitment to build 25,000 houses. It does take time to build houses. You can judge us on the figures.
Well, take time and all you can add is 20,000 in 5 years.
We've changed planning laws and we've kick-started. You can keep throwing the figures at me. You can't doubt this government's commitment to...
Well, the figures, of course you can doubt
changing
it.
planning law in order to increase house building. If this was a meeting of Tory MPs, you would have a lot of complaints about how many housing applications are going in their constituency, a lot of complaints from their constituents. So I'm pleased to see the 3,000 houses being built
Tory NIMBYs, is that?
in my constituency.
Tory NIMBYs.
Well, there are concerns from people who live in rural areas about the number of housings. You see Boris Johnson as well, very committed to increasing the numbers of houses in London.
All right, so what did you think?
What you can't say is
what did you think of
there's a housing problem.
No, we know there's a housing problem. It's your ability to solve it I'm arguing about. What's your... you wanted to talk briefly about PMQs.
Well, I just want to say I really enjoyed it, but I think the moment has passed.
Very good. No, you had your moment.
I thought he was very good.
A final thought from you.
I really enjoyed
but
it.
isn't it interesting? See, housing is an issue that lots and lots and lots of people care about, particularly
for young people
generationally.
Too. Yes.
And those are the people who in huge numbers signed up to be part of Jeremy Corbyn's campaign. Now, perhaps, had Jeremy Corbyn's crowdsourced question about housing been folled up with some questions like...
Well, Lisa Nandy's invited me to the shadow cabinet, so maybe I can do the briefing now.
Maybe you could
I think that the real problem...
But this is the point about the style.
But as you've seen what happened to me just now, I mean, I think the Prime Minister will panic when Jeremy Corbyn stands up and says, Andrew from Millbank has a question.
I can probably reveal that is not going to happen.
On that horrible prospect, we move on, Laura.
Rule it out, Andrew, now, immediately.
Great to have you with us. Thank you.
Careful what you wish for, Andrew.
Yeah.